The woman collapsed in the narrow room above the public house, her body convulsing against the stained floorboards. Gaslight flickered through the cracked window, casting long shadows across her contorted face. Her fingers clawed at her throat, seeking air that would not come, while foam gathered at the corners of her mouth. The boarding house keeper heard the thudding from below and climbed the stairs with practiced indifference. Such sounds were common enough in this corner of Lambeth, where morphine and gin claimed their share of souls each week. But when she pushed open the door, something in the woman's eyes spoke of a different kind of death. The spasms came in waves, each more violent than the last, the body arching impossibly backward as if trying to escape its own skin. Outside, the Thames fog rolled through the gaslit streets, muffling the distant calls of costermongers and the rumble of carriages crossing Waterloo Bridge. In the room, time seemed to slow, measured only by the woman's laboured breathing and the steady tick of a clock on the mantel. She would be dead before midnight. And somewhere in the maze of Lambeth streets, a man in a silk hat walked with the satisfied stride of one who had completed important work, his medical bag swinging gently at his side. Chapter 1: The Doctor Returns. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night settles around you now, wherever you find yourself in this quiet hour. Perhaps you listen from beneath warm blankets as rain taps against your window, or in the stillness of a room lit only by the glow of a screen. Whatever the time where you are, whatever corner of the world holds you now, we invite you to drift backward with us, cross more than a century to the autumn of 1891 and the fog-bound streets of London. Before you slip too deeply into sleep, if this journey into the past finds favour with you, do consider subscribing to this channel. Each subscription, each small gesture of support helps us continue these nighttime wanderings through history's darker corridors. And if tonight's tale proves worthy of your time, the algorithm favours those who share their approval, lifting our words to others who seek such stories in the deep hours. But these are merely the practicalities of our age. Let us leave them behind now and step into a different time, when gaslight held back the darkness and the Thames flowed thick with the commerce and sin of an empire at its height. The steamship from Canada docked at the port of London on the first day of October 1891, its hull scraped and weathered from the Atlantic crossing. Among the passengers who descended the gangway into the grey morning was a man of 41 years, slight of build but bearing himself with the confident posture of a professional gentleman. He wore a silk top hat and carried a walking stick with a silver handle, the very picture of Victorian respectability. His luggage, when it was brought down from the ship, included several leather cases of the sort carried by physicians, their contents secured with brass locks that gleamed despite the overcast sky. Thomas Neill Cream had returned to London, and the city received him with the indifference it showed to all returning travellers, swallowing him into its 8 million souls without ceremony or suspicion. He had been here before, though not for long and not recently. London knew him not at all, which suited his purposes admirably. The credentials he carried were legitimate enough: a medical degree from McGill University in Montreal, further study in Edinburgh, the birthplace he still claimed despite decades abroad. He spoke with the trace of a Scottish accent, carefully maintained, lending him an air of sober northern competence that English society found reassuring in matters of health and science. That he had spent the previous decade in North America, that he had served time in an Illinois prison for crimes, the details of which he shared with no one, that his medical practice had been marked by whispered scandals and sudden departures. These facts remained locked behind his practiced smile and gentleman's bearing. London in October presented itself in shades of grey and brown, the smoke from 10,000 chimneys hanging low over the streets, mixing with the river fog to create the particular gloom for which the city had earned its reputation. The great building works of the Victorian age had transformed vast stretches of the capital, yet still the Thames remained what it had always been, the dark artery through which the city's lifeblood flowed, carrying trade and wealth in one direction, filth and refuse in the other. South of the river, in the districts of Lambeth and Southwark, the streets narrowed and the buildings pressed close, their facades stained black with decades of coal smoke. Here lived the clerks and tradesmen, the seamstresses and laundresses, the costermongers and cab drivers who served the great machinery of empire without sharing in its magnificence. Cream secured lodgings at 103 Lambeth Palace Road, a respectable address despite its location south of the river. The residence stood within sight of the Archbishop of Canterbury's London Palace, that ancient complex of stone and red brick that had witnessed 7 centuries of English history. The proximity to such an establishment lent the neighbourhood a veneer of respectability, though the streets radiating outward from the palace told a different story. Here were the boarding houses and music halls, the public houses and pawn shops, the second-hand clothing dealers and the women who walked the streets when darkness fell. It was a district of transience and anonymity, where questions were rarely asked and the past was whatever a man claimed it to be. The rooms Cream took were furnished in the manner common to such establishments: a bed with a horsehair mattress, a washstand with basin and pitcher, a wardrobe of dark wood, a single chair positioned near the window. The gaslight fixtures on the walls provided illumination when the landlady came each evening to light them, though Cream often preferred to sit in the gathering darkness, watching the street below as the day's traffic thinned and a different population emerged. He unpacked his belongings with methodical care, hanging his dark suits in the wardrobe, arranging his collars and cravats in the drawers, placing his brushes and toiletries on the washstand, the medical bags he stored beneath the bed, their contents known only to himself. Within days of his arrival, Cream had established a routine that marked him as a gentleman of leisure rather than a physician actively seeking patients. He rose late, took his breakfast at a nearby coffee house, and spent his afternoons walking the streets of Lambeth and Westminster, his stick tapping against the pavement, his eyes observing everything with the keen interest of one cataloguing the particulars of a foreign land. He frequented the public houses in the evening, not as a drunkard but as a man of moderate habits who enjoyed the society of his fellow creatures. He spoke easily with strangers, offering opinions on the news of the day, the weather, the state of trade. He mentioned his medical background when it suited him, though he seemed in no hurry to establish a practice. The London he observed in those autumn weeks was a city of stark contrasts, its wealth and poverty existing side by side with the casual indifference of long familiarity. The great thoroughfares sparkled with electric light, that new marvel that was slowly replacing the yellow glow of gas, while the side streets remained pools of shadow where anything might transpire beyond the notice of respectable society. Omnibuses and hansom cabs crowded the main roads, their wheels clattering over cobblestones worn smooth by generations of traffic. The Underground Railway, the engineering triumph completed 3 decades earlier, carried its passengers through tunnels beneath the city's surface, emerging at stations where the smoke and steam mingled with the fog to create an atmosphere that seemed to belong more to some industrial hell than to the capital of an empire. South of the river, where Cream had chosen to establish himself, the character of the city changed. The buildings were lower, their architecture less grand. The shops catered to working people rather than the carriage trade. The public houses were more numerous and rougher in character, their clientele less concerned with appearances. And the women who worked these streets, who made their living from the desires of men, were visible in a way they were not in the West End, where such commerce was conducted with more discretion. These women interested Cream particularly. He watched them from the windows of public houses, observed their comings and goings, noted which ones worked alone and which had protectors, which ones appeared healthy and which showed signs of illness or desperation. The newspapers that autumn were full of sensation, as London papers always were. The Whitechapel murders of 3 years earlier still echoed in the public consciousness, that series of savage killings that had terrorized the East End and elevated an unknown killer to the status of legend. Jack the Ripper, the press had named him, and though the murders had ceased as mysteriously as they had begun, the fascination remained. The idea that a monster could walk undetected through London streets, selecting victims at will, had shaken the Victorian certainty that civilization had conquered the darkness. New crimes were measured against that terrible standard, and the police remained sensitive to any suggestion that such horrors might return. But in October of 1891, the streets of Lambeth seemed peaceful enough. The gas lamps came on each evening at dusk, their light pushing back the shadows. The policemen walked their beats with steady tread, their presence meant to reassure the law-abiding and deter the criminal. The great machinery of justice, the courts and prisons, the detectives of Scotland Yard, the elaborate apparatus of Victorian law enforcement, stood ready to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. It was a system built on certainty, on the belief that evidence and reason could solve any mystery, that science and progress had illuminated the dark corners where evil once flourished. Thomas Neill Cream walked those gaslit streets with his stick and his silk hat, a gentleman taking the evening air. He nodded to the policemen he passed, exchanged pleasantries with shopkeepers, bought flowers occasionally from the women who sold them on street corners. He appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a physician of moderate means, recently returned from abroad and seeking to establish himself in London society. His rooms were paid for in advance, his manner was courteous, his clothes were clean and well maintained. There was nothing in his appearance or behaviour to suggest anything other than respectability. Yet beneath that carefully maintained exterior, behind the professional smile and the gentleman's bearing, something else resided, a coldness and nearness, perhaps that occasionally showed itself in his eyes when he thought himself unobserved, an intensity of focus when he watched the women on the streets, a calculating quality that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with assessment. He carried his medical knowledge the way another man might carry a weapon, aware of its power, cognizant of the possibilities it offered. He understood the human body, understood its vulnerabilities, understood how easily the machinery of life could be disrupted by someone who knew precisely where to apply pressure. The autumn deepened, the days grew shorter and the fog grew thicker, rolling up from the Thames each evening to blanket the southern districts in a grey-white shroud that muffled sound and obscured vision. The streets of Lambeth took on a dreamlike quality in such weather, familiar landmarks becoming strange, distances deceiving the senses. It was the kind of fog that the city's criminals appreciated, the kind that allowed movement without witness, that swallowed screams and hid evidence, that made the already dark streets into corridors of absolute mystery. And in his rooms on Lambeth Palace Road, Thomas Neill Cream sat by his window and watched the fog roll past and thought about the work he intended to do. Chapter 2. The Women of the Waterloo Road. The district south of the Thames had its own geography, its own laws, its own understanding of how life was to be lived. The Great Bridge at Waterloo carried thousands across the river each day, the railway terminus behind it disgorging passengers from Surrey and Hampshire and the southern counties into the capital's embrace. But those who lived in the streets radiating out from the bridge's southern foot rarely crossed to the northern bank except to work. Their world was bounded by the Thames to the north, the Old Kent Road to the south, the river's curve enclosing a territory of narrow streets and close-packed buildings where the sun rarely penetrated to street level, even at midsummer. Here the laundresses worked their copper boilers in basement rooms, the steam rising through grates in the pavement. Here the rag and bone men sorted their takings in yards piled high with refuse, searching for anything that might be sold or repurposed. Here the seamstresses bent over their needles in rooms lit by single candles, their eyes failing young from the strain. Here the costermongers wheeled their barrows through streets barely wide enough for two men to pass abreast, crying their wares in voices hoarse from calling. And here the women, who had no other trade, walked the gaslit corners, waiting for the men who crossed the bridge seeking pleasures they could not or would not pursue north of the river. These women occupied a particular stratum of Victorian society, neither the lowest nor anywhere near respectable. They were not the streetwalkers of the East End, those desperate creatures who sold themselves for pennies in the shadows of shipping warehouses, nor were they the kept women of the West End, installed in comfortable apartments by wealthy protectors who visited according to predetermined schedules. The women of Lambeth existed in between, renting their own rooms in boarding houses, managing their own affairs, revealing a clientele of clerks and commercial travellers, soldiers on leave and workmen with wages to spend. Some were young, newly arrived from the countryside, or fallen from positions in service. Others were older, their youth gone, but their need for survival undiminished. Ellen Donworth was 20 years old in the autumn of 1891, though the life she had led made her appear older. She had come to London from Lincolnshire 3 years earlier, following a situation in a county household that had ended badly. The details of that ending she shared with no one, but the result was that she found herself in the capital without references, without prospects, without the protection that a respectable position afforded. She had tried honest work at first, seeking employment in shops and factories, but the positions available to young women paid wages insufficient for survival. Her room cost 4 shillings a week at minimum. Food and coal and the other necessities of existence consumed whatever remained. The arithmetic of poverty left little choice. She resided in a boarding house on Duke Street, a narrow thoroughfare that ran parallel to the Westminster Bridge Road. The building was 4 stories of begrimed brick, its windows clouded with years of coal smoke, its front steps worn concave by generations of feet. Inside, the hallways were dark even at midday, lit by gas jets that the landlord kept turned low to save expense. The rooms were small and cold, furnished with whatever mismatched pieces could be obtained cheaply at auction. But they offered privacy of a sort, a door that could be locked, a space that was one's own in a city where most working people shared beds in shifts, where families of 8 crowded into single rooms, where privacy was a luxury beyond the reach of all but the prosperous. Ellen's room was on the 3rd floor, facing the street. A narrow bed occupied most of the space, its frame of iron painted black, its mattress thin and lumpy. A washstand stood beneath the window bearing a chipped basin and a pitcher for water that had to be carried up from the ground floor tap, a single chair, a small table, a handful of hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. This constituted the entirety of her domestic arrangements. She kept the room clean despite its shabbiness, swept the floor each morning, emptied the basin from the window into the street below. On the table she kept a hairbrush with several teeth missing, a hand mirror with the silver backing flaking away, and a small tin box containing the few items of jewellery she owned, paste gems and plated metal, worthless to anyone but herself. Her routine followed the rhythms of her trade. She rose late, breakfasted on bread and tea, spent the afternoon hours mending her clothes or sleeping. As evening approached, she prepared herself for work with the limited resources available, brushing her hair, pinning it up beneath a small hat decorated with artificial flowers, applying a trace of rouge to her cheeks, donning a dress that had seen better days but remained presentable in gaslight. Then she descended to the street and walked the short distance to the corner of Westminster Bridge Road, where the traffic was heaviest and the likelihood of encountering potential customers greatest. The work was neither complicated nor particularly dangerous if one exercised reasonable caution. The client was selected based on appearance and manner. Well-dressed men were preferred. Those who appeared drunk were avoided. Groups were never approached. Terms were negotiated in low voices, a few minutes of conversation establishing price and expectations. The transaction itself took place in her room, the boarding house landlady asking no questions about the men who came and went at irregular hours. Payment was rendered in coin, counted carefully, tucked away in the tin box. The client departed and another evening's survival was secured. Yet survival was not the same as living. Ellen understood this distinction even if she rarely articulated it, even to herself. She had imagined a different life when she left Lincolnshire, had harboured vague hopes of respectable employment, of eventually saving enough to rent a better room, perhaps to marry a tradesman or clerk, to rejoin the ranks of decent society. But London had taught her that such dreams were as substantial as the fog that drifted through its streets. She was what she was, and the trajectory of her existence pointed steadily downward, toward the future that awaited women of her profession. Disease, violence, the workhouse, or the pauper's grave. She was not alone in this knowledge. The other women who worked the streets around Waterloo held similar histories, similar disappointments, similar recognition of their probable fate. They were not friends precisely, for competition prevented true friendship, but they were not quite strangers either. They exchanged information about dangerous customers, warned each other away from men known to be violent, shared remedies for the various ailments that afflicted their profession. They understood each other in the way that soldiers in the same army understand each other, bound together by shared circumstance, if not by affection. Matilda Clover was older than Ellen, 27 years, and marked by them. She had been working the streets longer, and it showed in her face, in the hardness around her eyes, in the way she assessed every situation for advantage or threat. She lived on Lamberton Road in rooms slightly better than Ellen's, a small point of pride that she maintained through careful management of her earnings. She was more selective in her clientele than the younger women, having learned through experience to identify men likely to pay well and treat her with a modicum of respect. She spoke less and listened more, watching the street with the wariness of one who understood that survival depended on constant vigilance. Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel shared rooms in Orient Buildings, one of the newer constructions in the district, a block of workers' apartments that rose 4 stories and housed dozens of families in identical small flats. The two women presented themselves as sisters, though whether this was truth or convenient fiction none could say. They were young, both under 25, and worked together, which provided a measure of safety that solitary women lacked. They could watch each other's rooms, warn each other of threats, pool their resources during lean times. Their rooms faced a central courtyard rather than the street, which afforded them slightly more privacy than those whose windows opened onto public thoroughfares. These women, and in others like them, constituted a hidden population, invisible to respectable society except as occasional figures glimpsed from carriage windows, as statistics in police reports, as subjects of reform sermons delivered by clergy who never ventured into the streets where such women actually lived. Victorian morality held them in contempt, labelled them fallen women, painted them as vectors of disease and corruption, blamed them for their own degradation. That poverty might drive a woman to such work, that the structure of society itself might create the conditions that made such work inevitable. These were not questions that respectable opinion entertained. The police knew them, of course. The constables who walked the Lambeth beats recognised the regular faces, knew which women worked which corners, intervened when disputes threatened to become violent, or when complaints were lodged about particular locations. But the law took little interest in prostitution itself, unless it was conducted with unusual visibility, or unless it involved children or coercion. The occasional arrest was made, the occasional fine levied, but for the most part the authorities accepted that such commerce would continue regardless of legal prohibition, and contented themselves with maintaining a surface order that allowed respectable citizens to pretend the problem did not exist. The men who visited these women came from every stratum of society below the genuinely wealthy. Clerks from the government offices in Whitehall crossed the bridge seeking cheaper rates than the West End offered. Soldiers from the barracks near Chelsea found their way to Lambeth for the same reason. Travelling salesmen staying in the cheaper hotels south of the river sought company for the evening. Married men whose wives were absent or indifferent paid for services they claimed not to require at home. The trade was steady, the demand constant, the economics as reliable as any other form of commerce in the capital. Into this world Thomas Neill Cream inserted himself with the careful deliberation of one conducting a scientific investigation. He watched from public house windows, noting which women worked alone, which appeared most vulnerable, which seemed to have no protectors or regular clients who might ask questions. He observed their routines, learned their territories, identified the boarding houses where they lived. He presented himself as a potential client, approaching women on the street corners, engaging them in conversation, establishing himself as a familiar face. He was generous in small ways, buying drinks when he encountered them in public houses, offering coins without demanding services in return, creating the impression of a gentleman who enjoyed their company, but was in no particular hurry to consummate commercial transactions. The women found him odd, but not immediately threatening. He was older than most of their clients, more formally dressed, more educated in his speech. He claimed to be a physician, which interested some and made others wary. Doctors knew too much about the diseases that haunted their profession, could identify symptoms that women preferred to keep hidden. But he seemed harmless enough, even kind in his way. He spoke to them as if they were persons rather than commodities, asked about their lives, their origins, their circumstances. That such interest might be predatory rather than benevolent did not occur to them. Men who meant violence usually advertised it in their manner, their roughness, their contempt. Cream's courtesy disarmed suspicion. October faded into November, and the fog grew thicker. The gas lamps struggled against the darkness, their light diffusing into yellow halos that illuminated nothing beyond a few feet. The streets became treacherous, familiar routes transformed into mazes where one wrong turn could lead anywhere. The Thames could be heard but not seen, its waters lapping against the embankment, the horns of river traffic sounding mournfully through the murk. In such weather, fewer men ventured across the bridges. Fewer women stood on the corners, the whole city seeming to retreat indoors to wait for clearer skies. But some business continued regardless of conditions. The public houses remained open, their interiors thick with pipe smoke and the smell of gin, their fires burning coal that added to the smoke outside. The boarding houses maintained their routines, landladies collecting rents, tenants coming and going. And the women still walked their territories when circumstances required, still brought clients back to their rooms, still engaged in the transactions that kept them housed and fed. Ellen Donworth worked through the fog, her small figure appearing and disappearing in the murk like a ghost. Matilda Clover maintained her corner despite the weather, her shawl pulled tight against the damp. Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel ventured out together, their voices preceding them through the fog-muffled streets. They did not know that they were being observed, that the gentleman in the silk hat was taking note of their movements, their vulnerabilities, their isolation. They did not know that in his rooms on Lambeth Palace Road, Thomas Neill Cream was making preparations, arranging the contents of his medical bag, selecting certain vials and powders with the careful attention of one about to begin important work. The fog pressed close against every window, obscuring the future as thoroughly as it obscured the street. And in that obscurity, in that blindness, death prepared to make its entrance into the narrative. Chapter 3. The First Death. The evening of October the 13th began no differently than any other for Ellen Donworth. She rose from her bed in the late afternoon, the light already failing outside her window, the gas not yet lit in the hallway. The room held the chill of an English autumn, the kind of cold that settled into walls and floors and resisted all efforts at warming. She dressed slowly, pulling on her worn undergarments, the corset that dug into her ribs, the dress that had been dark blue once but had faded to an indeterminate grey. Her fingers were stiff with cold as she worked the buttons, arranged her hair, pinned on the small hat that served as the marker of her attempt at respectability. She had eaten nothing since morning, a piece of bread left from the previous day's purchase. Her appetite was small in any case, had been diminishing for weeks, though she attributed this to the general malaise that afflicted most people as winter approached. The coal fire in her room remained unlit. Coal cost money and her earnings had been sparse lately. Better to spend the evening hours on the street where she would keep warm through movement, and return to the room only when business was concluded and sleep was the only requirement. She descended the dark stairs, her hand trailing along the wall for guidance, emerged into Duke Street as the lamplighter was making his rounds. The man moved from post to post with practiced efficiency, using his long pole to reach the gas jets, leaving small pools of yellow light in his wake. Ellen turned toward Westminster Bridge Road, her destination the corner where she had worked for more than a year, where the regulars knew to find her, and passing trade was likely enough to make the standing worthwhile. The evening was relatively clear, the fog that had plagued recent weeks having lifted enough to reveal the buildings across the street, the movement of traffic, the faces of passers-by. The air held that particular London smell, coal smoke and horse manure, the dampness of the Thames, the various effluence of 8 million people living in close proximity. She had long since ceased to notice it, the way residents of any city cease to register the sensory details that visitors find overwhelming. She took up her position on the corner, arranging herself in a posture that was neither too forward nor too retiring, projecting availability while maintaining a veneer of dignity. Other women worked nearby, each maintaining her own territory through unspoken agreement, acknowledging each other with slight nods but no conversation. The evening traffic moved past. Omnibuses crowded with clerks returning from the city, hansom cabs conveying better-dressed passengers to destinations south of the river, private carriages whose occupants remained invisible behind curtained windows. The foot traffic was heavy as well, working men heading home or toward public houses, women returning from market with baskets, children running errands before full darkness made the streets too dangerous for the young. She waited an hour with no success. The men who passed either ignored her completely or were accompanied by companions that made approach impossible. She thought about returning to her room, about abandoning the evening's effort, but the rent was due in 2 days and she was short 3 shillings. 3 shillings meant 3 customers at her usual rate, or 2 if they were generous. She could not afford to give up so easily. The gentleman in the silk hat appeared around 8 o'clock, emerging from the direction of Lambeth Palace Road, his walking stick tapping against the pavement. Ellen recognised him. He had spoken with her on previous evenings, had bought her drinks twice in the past week, had promised future business though he had not yet engaged her services. He smiled when he saw her, raised his stick in greeting, crossed the street to stand beside her under the gas lamp. Thomas Neill Cream wore his professional face to him, the expression of benevolent interest that he had perfected over years of medical practice. He inquired after her health, commented on the weather, mentioned that he had been thinking about her since their last meeting. His accent placed him as Scottish, educated, the sort of man who should have been consulting patients in Harley Street, rather than conversing with prostitutes in Lambeth. Ellen found his attention flattering in spite of herself. Men of his class rarely treated women of her profession with such courtesy. He suggested they take a drink together at a nearby public house, his treat, an offer she accepted gratefully. The warmth of the pub's interior was welcome after standing in the cold, and the gin he bought her spread heat through her chest and belly. They sat in a corner away from the main crowd, he with a glass of whiskey he barely touched, she with her gin which she finished quickly and which he replaced without her needing to ask. He asked about her life, her origins, how she had come to London. She gave vague answers, the story she had constructed over years of such inquiries, leaving out the details that were too painful or too personal to share with strangers. After an hour he suggested they retire to her rooms. He would pay her well, he said, more than her usual rate. 2 shillings rather than 1. She agreed immediately, the amount representing significant money to her, nearly enough to cover what she needed for the rent. They left the public house together. His hand at her elbow in a parody of gentlemanly escort walked the short distance to her building on Duke Street. The landlady was in her rooms on the ground floor and did not emerge as they climbed the stairs. Such comings and goings were too common to warrant attention. In her room, Ellen lit the gas, turned it low to save fuel, and to create the dim atmosphere that made such transactions easier for all concerned. Cream set his stick against the wall, removed his hat and gloves, placed them carefully on the chair. From his coat pocket he produced a small box, which he opened to reveal several pills of white powder compressed into tablet form. He held them out to her, explained that they would help with her complexion, improve her general health, make her more attractive to potential clients. He was a physician, he reminded her, and he could see that she was not in the best of health. These pills would help. They cost nothing. He gave them to her as a kindness, as something he did for women he favoured. Ellen looked at the pills with uncertainty. She was not accustomed to gifts that came without explicit price, not practised in evaluating the motivations of men who offered assistance without obvious benefit to themselves. But he was a doctor, and she did feel unwell lately, and he had been kind to her. She accepted the pills, placed them on the small table beside her bed. He urged her to take them now, while he was present, so he could observe any effects and ensure they suited her constitution. She hesitated only a moment before complying, placing 2 of the tablets on her tongue, washing them down with water from the pitcher. The transaction that followed was brief and unremarkable. Cream performed with mechanical efficiency, his mind clearly elsewhere, completing the act more as obligation than desire. He paid her the promised 2 shillings, dressed quickly, gathered his things. As he prepared to leave, he reminded her to take the remaining pills over the next few days, promised to check on her progress later in the week. She thanked him, saw him to the door, locked it behind him after he descended the stairs. She prepared for sleep, washing herself at the basin, changing into the thin nightdress that served for sleeping, extinguishing the gas. The room fell into darkness except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside her window. She lay on the narrow bed and pulled the thin blanket over herself, seeking warmth that the fabric could not provide. Her stomach felt unsettled, though whether from the gin or the pills or the general emptiness of too little food she could not determine. She closed her eyes and waited for sleep. It came slowly, and when it finally arrived, it brought strange dreams. She was walking through fog so thick she could not see her own hands, could not tell if her eyes were open or closed. Voices called to her from directions she could not determine. Her legs felt heavy, as if she were wading through deep water. She tried to respond but found she could not open her mouth, could not make her voice function properly. She woke in darkness, unsure how long she had slept. Her stomach churned violently, and she barely had time to reach the basin before she began to vomit. The spasms came in waves, emptying her stomach of the gin and the bread and everything else until she was retching bile, then nothing at all. She gripped the sides of the basin, her body shaking, sweat coating her skin despite the cold of the room. When the vomiting finally ceased, she tried to return to bed, but her legs would not support her properly. She collapsed halfway across the room, her body striking the floor with force that drove the air from her lungs. The pain began then, starting in her stomach and spreading outward, a burning sensation that felt as if her organs were being consumed by fire. Her muscles began to contract involuntarily, her back arching, her legs drawing up toward her chest. She tried to call out but produced only a strangled gasp, the muscles of her throat refusing to obey her will. Her fingers clawed at the floorboards, seeking purchase, seeking relief that did not exist. The convulsions came in waves, each more violent than the last. Her body contorted impossibly, the muscles contracting with force sufficient to crack bone. Foam gathered at her mouth, pink tinged with blood where she had bitten her tongue. Her eyes rolled back in her head, seeing nothing but darkness and fragmentary images that her failing brain could not process. The pain was beyond anything she had experienced, beyond anything she could have imagined. A torture that seemed to last hours, though in reality mere minutes passed. She tried to understand what was happening to her, tried to make sense of the agony, but her thoughts fragmented and scattered. The pills, some distant part of her mind suggested. The pills the doctor had given her. But the thought could not be completed. Could not be held long enough to become understanding. There was only pain. Only the body destroying itself from within. Only the slow drowning as her lungs filled with fluid and her heart struggled to pump blood through vessels that were collapsing. The boarding house was silent around her. The other tenants slept or were absent. The landlady in her ground floor rooms heard nothing over the ordinary sounds of the street. No one came to investigate. No one offered assistance. Ellen Donworth died alone on the floor of her rented room, her body twisted into an unnatural position, her face locked in an expression of terminal agony. The gas lamp outside her window continued to burn, casting its yellow light through the smudged glass, illuminating nothing. Hours passed before the landlady, making her morning rounds, found the door still locked. She used her master key, pushed open the door, discovered the body on the floor. She had seen death before, in a building housing transient populations. Death was not uncommon. But there was something about this death, about the position of the body, about the expression on the figure that struck her as wrong. She sent for the police immediately, standing guard outside the room until a constable arrived from the nearby station. The policeman examined the scene with professional detachment. A young woman, obviously of questionable profession given the location and circumstances, dead in her room with no obvious signs of violence. The most likely explanation was an overdose of laudanum or some other opiate, possibly accidental, possibly intentional. Such deaths occurred regularly among women of her class. The body would need to be examined by a police surgeon, an inquest would be held, but there seemed little mystery about the matter. Another sad casualty of the vice trade, another body for a pauper's grave. The constable made notes in his book, asked the landlady about the woman's habits and associations. She could provide little information. The rent had been paid regularly, the woman had caused no disturbances, men had visited, but that was expected given her profession. Had anyone visited the previous evening? The landlady could not say for certain. People came and went at all hours. She did not monitor the movements of her tenants so long as they paid their rent and created no problems. The body was removed to the mortuary. The room was locked pending further investigation. The landlady cleaned the floor where Ellen had died, scrubbing away the bodily fluids, preparing the room for the next tenant. By afternoon, the room was available for rent again, all traces of the previous occupant's death erased. This was London. This was Lambeth. Life continued regardless of death, and rooms could not remain vacant when others were waiting. And in his lodgings on Lambeth Palace Road, Thomas Neill Cream sat at his table and began composing a letter, his handwriting precise, his tone righteous, his purpose known only to himself. Chapter 4. Letters in the Dark. The inquest into Ellen Donworth's death convened 4 days after her body was discovered, held in a public room adjacent to the mortuary where her remains rested in the temporary storage awaiting burial. The proceedings were routine, conducted by a coroner who had presided over hundreds of such inquiries, attended by a jury of local tradesmen fulfilling their civic obligation with varying degrees of interest. The formalities of Victorian justice required that all sudden or unexplained deaths be investigated, that the cause be determined and recorded, that society could reassure itself that proper procedure had been followed, even if the deceased was a person of no particular importance. The police surgeon who had examined the body testified first. He described his findings in the clinical language of medical science. Female, approximately 20 years of age, poorly nourished, showing signs of chronic ill health common among women of her profession. The body had been found in a state suggesting violent convulsions prior to death, the facial muscles locked in what medical men called risus sardonicus, a grotesque grin produced by extreme muscle contraction. The stomach contents had been examined and showed evidence of recent alcohol consumption, but nothing obviously poisonous. The lungs had been congested, the heart showed signs of strain. His conclusion, delivered with professional certainty, was that death had resulted from natural causes, likely a seizure brought on by alcoholism and general debility. Women of her class frequently died young, their constitutions weakened by poor diet, exposure to disease, and the various abuses their profession entailed. The landlady gave evidence next. She confirmed the basic facts. The deceased had rented a room for more than a year, had paid her rent regularly, had received male visitors as was common among women of her type. On the night of her death, the landlady had neither seen nor heard anything unusual. The body had been discovered the following morning when the deceased had failed to emerge and the door remained locked from inside. The room had contained no suicide note, no empty bottles that might suggest deliberate poisoning, nothing to indicate anything other than a sudden death from natural causes. The jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes before returning a verdict of death by natural causes, likely related to chronic alcoholism and the debilitated condition common to prostitutes. The coroner recorded this finding, signed the necessary papers, released the body for burial. Ellen Donworth's death became a statistic, another line in the register of mortality, another forgotten soul consigned to an unmarked grave in one of South London's overcrowded cemeteries. The inquest concluded, the participants dispersed, and the machinery of justice moved on to other matters. But 3 days after the inquest, a letter arrived at the offices of the coroner, who had presided over the proceedings. The envelope was of good quality paper, the address written in neat copperplate script, the postmark indicating it had been mailed from within London. The coroner opened it without particular interest. Correspondence relating to inquests was common enough, usually from family members seeking additional information or contesting findings. He unfolded the single sheet of writing paper and began to read. The letter claimed that Ellen Donworth had been murdered, that the verdict of natural causes was incorrect, that the inquest had been a travesty of justice. The writer identified himself as a friend of the deceased, someone who knew that she had been given poisonous pills by a doctor named Thomas Neill, a Canadian physician recently arrived in London and residing in Lambeth. The pills had been strychnine, the letter stated, and the death had been deliberate murder. The writer demanded that the case be reopened, that the body be exhumed and properly examined, that this Neill be arrested and tried for his crime. The letter was signed with a name the coroner did not recognise, A. O'Brien, detective. The coroner read the letter twice, frowning. The claims it contained were extraordinary, and if true represented a serious failure of the initial investigation. But the letter itself was problematic. No detective of his acquaintance would write such a letter. If a policeman had evidence of murder, he would present it through official channels, not via anonymous correspondence. The signature was likely false, the accusations perhaps motivated by some personal grievance or delusion. Still, the specific nature of the claims, the mention of strychnine, the identification of a particular individual demanded some level of response. He forwarded the letter to Scotland Yard, attaching a note explaining the circumstances of the original inquest and requesting that the Criminal Investigation Department determine whether the accusations warranted further investigation. The letter passed through several hands at police headquarters, was read by various inspectors and sergeants, generated discussion about how to proceed. The consensus was that the letter was probably the work of a crank, but that some minimal investigation should be conducted, if only to satisfy the coroner that the matter had been properly examined. A detective sergeant was assigned to make inquiries. He visited the boarding house where Ellen Donworth had lived, questioned the landlady again, asked about this Thomas Neill. The landlady recalled no one by that name, though she admitted that she did not ask the names of visitors who came to her tenants' rooms. He examined the room where the death had occurred, finding it already occupied by a new tenant, any evidence of the previous occupant's demise long since removed. He made inquiries among the other women who worked the streets around Westminster Bridge Road, asking if any of them knew of a doctor named Neill who had been associating with prostitutes. None recognised the name, though several mentioned a gentleman in a silk hat who had been buying drinks for working girls, claiming to be a physician. The descriptions they provided were vague and contradictory. He was tall, or perhaps not tall, middle-aged, Scottish, or possibly Irish, well-dressed but not wealthy. The detective sergeant also attempted to determine whether any strychnine had been purchased recently in the district. He visited chemists' shops, asking to examine their poison registers, the books in which the law required all sales of dangerous substances to be recorded. He found several recent sales of strychnine, but all had been for legitimate purposes, to gentlemen requiring rat poison, to gardeners needing to control vermin. None of the purchases matched the vague descriptions of the doctor who had been seen with prostitutes. After a week of investigation, the detective sergeant filed his report. He concluded that the letter was likely a hoax, that no evidence supported the claim of murder, that the original verdict of death by natural causes should stand. He noted the possibility that some individual calling himself a doctor had been associating with local prostitutes, but this was not itself a crime, and the descriptions obtained were insufficient to identify any particular person. He recommended that no further action be taken unless additional evidence came to light. His superiors accepted this recommendation, filed the report and considered the matter closed. But the letters did not stop. A second arrived at the office of a Member of Parliament whose constituency included portions of Lambeth, making similar accusations, demanding action. A third reached the desk of a newspaper editor, though after consideration he declined to publish it, judging it too speculative to print without corroboration. A fourth went to a prominent physician who had testified at medical inquests, accusing him of incompetence for failing to detect murder. Each letter was written in the same neat hand, signed with different names, sometimes O'Brien, sometimes Malone, sometimes other Irish-sounding surnames that investigation proved to be inventions. The letters shared certain characteristics beyond their accusations. They were written on good quality paper, suggesting the author was at least moderately prosperous. The handwriting was educated, the spelling perfect, the grammar correct. The tone oscillated between righteous indignation and a peculiar formality, as if the writer was simultaneously furious about injustice and determined to maintain proper epistolary conventions. They contained specific details about Ellen Donworth's death, the convulsion, the locked room, the time of death, details that had not been widely reported and that only someone closely familiar with the case would know. Most peculiarly, some of the letters contained demands for money. The writer claimed to possess evidence that would prove murder beyond doubt, evidence that he would provide to the authorities unless he received payment for his silence. The amounts demanded were not large. £5, £10, some sufficient to interest a blackmailer working among the lower classes, but hardly worth the attention of someone genuinely wealthy. The letters named specific individuals as the murderer, sometimes the mysterious Dr. Neill, sometimes other doctors who had no connection to Lambeth or to prostitutes, sometimes prominent citizens whose only crime was having testified at medical inquests in the past. Scotland Yard received several of these letters and placed them in a file marked as the work of a probable lunatic. London received hundreds of such letters each year, anonymous accusations, demands for money, claims of vast conspiracies, the detritus of disturbed minds and malicious hearts. The police could not investigate every crank claim that arrived in the mail. They required evidence, witnesses, some concrete basis for believing a crime had actually occurred. A prostitute dying of what appeared to be natural causes, however suspicious one letter writer found it, did not rise to the level requiring significant police resources. Yet someone at Scotland Yard noted that the letters kept coming, that their frequency seemed to be increasing rather than diminishing as usually happened with such correspondence. Someone filed them all together, preserving them even though they seemed to lead nowhere, perhaps sensing that the persistence of the writer indicated something more than ordinary mania. The file grew slowly, each new letter added to the collection, each exhibiting that same precise handwriting, that same peculiar mixture of accusation and demand. In Lambeth, life continued its ordinary course. The women worked their corners, the public houses served their customers, the landlords collected their rents. Another woman died in November, found in her rooms on Lamberton Road, her body exhibiting the same signs of violent convulsion that had marked Ellen Donworth's death. Matilda Clover was older, 27, and her death attracted even less attention than the first. The inquest returned a verdict of death by alcoholic poisoning. Delirium tremens was the medical term, and she was buried in an unmarked grave beside Ellen, though neither of them would have known they had become neighbours in death. No letters arrived about Matilda Clover's death, at least not immediately. The anonymous correspondent seemed to have moved on to other concerns, his attention drawn elsewhere. But the police file remained open, a small collection of letters bound together with string, sitting in a cabinet at Scotland Yard alongside hundreds of other unsolved mysteries, waiting for something to connect them to a larger pattern, to transform them from the ravings of a madman into evidence of something far darker. And Thomas Neill Cream walked the streets of Lambeth, his silk hat gleaming under the gas lamps, his medical bag swinging at his side, a gentleman taking the evening air. He spoke to women on corners, bought Durance in public houses, visited chemist shops to purchase small amounts of strychnine for purposes he explained as related to medical experiments. He wrote more letters, posting them from different parts of the city, varying his signatures, refining his accusations. He seemed to derive satisfaction from this correspondence, from the knowledge that his words were being read by officials and gentlemen, that he was manipulating the machinery of justice even as he evaded its grasp. The fog rolled in again as December approached. The Thames disappearing behind curtains of grey-white vapour, the gas lamps becoming faint suggestions of light in the murk. The temperature dropped and the first frost appeared on windows and rooftops. The women who worked the streets wrapped themselves in whatever additional clothing that they could obtain, their breath visible in the cold air, their fingers numb despite threadbare gloves. They watched for customers and watched for the police and watched for the dangers that accompanied their profession. They did not know that among those dangers, walking unseen in the fog, was a man who had already killed twice and would kill again. Chapter 5. The Second Victim. Winter settled over London with the particular misery it reserved for those without adequate shelter or fuel. The Thames froze at its margins, ice forming in plates along the embankments, the centre channel remaining open only because of the constant traffic of barges and steamships that ploughed through the cold water. The temperature fell below freezing most nights, rose only slightly during the brief daylight hours, created conditions that tested the endurance of even the prosperous. For the poor of Lambeth, winter represented a trial of survival, a season when the weakest among them simply failed to endure, their bodies discovered frozen in doorways or dead in unheated rooms, casualties of poverty more than weather. Matilda Clover had survived 27 winters, more than many women of her profession managed. She had come to London from Derbyshire nearly a decade earlier, following circumstances she never discussed, establishing herself in the trade with the pragmatic acceptance of one who understood that morality was a luxury reserved for those with choices. She was neither beautiful nor particularly charming, but she possessed a quality that ensured steady work. She was reliable, discreet, capable of conducting business without drama or complications. Her regular clients valued these traits and returned to her rather than seeking younger or prettier alternatives. She maintained rooms on Lamberton Road, a street that ran roughly parallel to Westminster Bridge Road, connecting the commercial thoroughfare with the residential districts beyond. The building was older than those on Duke Street, its brick darker with age, its interior more decrepit, but the rent was slightly lower, and Matilda had learned over the years that economy in housing costs allowed for better quality and other necessities. She ate more regularly than many women in her profession, maintained a small coal fire in her room even when fuel prices rose, possessed several changes of clothing and kept them in good repair. These were the markers of professional success at her level of society. Not wealth, certainly, but a degree above absolute destitution. Her room was on the second floor, larger than Ellen Donworth's had been, with 2 windows rather than 1, allowing more light during the day. She had furnished it over the years with items purchased at second-hand markets, a proper bed with a wooden frame rather than iron, a small table with 2 chairs, a chest of drawers, a mirror that hung on the wall and required careful positioning to avoid the crack that ran diagonally across its surface. On the mantel above the fireplace she kept several items of personal significance, a photograph of a woman who might have been her mother, a small china dog whose paint was chipping, a tin containing the money she was slowly accumulating against future need. She knew most of the women who worked the nearby streets, having outlasted several generations of younger girls who had entered and exited the profession through various means. Some had married and escaped. Some had died of disease or violence. Some had descended into the darker territories of addiction or madness that waited for those who lacked the strength to resist. Matilda had avoided these fates through careful management of risk, through an ability to assess men quickly and refuse those who showed signs of danger, through a stubborn determination to survive that had carried her through circumstances that had destroyed others. She had noticed the gentleman in the silk hat weeks earlier, had observed him speaking with Ellen Donworth before that woman's death. She had heard about Ellen's death, heard the rumours that circulated among the working women. Some said it was drink, others said a bad heart. A few whispered darker possibilities that were quickly dismissed. Deaths among their population were common enough that each one did not require extensive investigation. Matilda had attended no funeral, offered no prayers. She simply noted the removal of a competitor and continued her own work. The gentleman approached her in mid-November, on a night when the cold had driven most other women indoors and left the street corners relatively empty. She was standing near the entrance to a public house, not inside where warmth would have cost the price of a drink she did not need, but close enough to benefit from the heat that escaped each time the door opened. He emerged from the darkness, his stick tapping against the pavement, his breath visible in the frozen air. He raised his hat in greeting, introduced himself as Dr. Neill, mentioned that he had seen her working this territory, and wondered if she might be available for his patronage. Matilda assessed him with practiced efficiency. Well-dressed, educated speech, older than most clients but not elderly, no visible signs of violence or drunkenness. His manner was formal, almost courtly, treating her as if she were a respectable woman rather than a prostitute. This could indicate either genuine courtesy or calculated manipulation, but either way the transaction would be the same. She named her price, he agreed without negotiation, and they walked together to her rooms on Lamberton Road. In her room, with the gas lit and the coal fire burning low, Cream repeated the pattern he had established with Ellen Donworth. He produced pills from his pocket, explained that they were medical preparations that would improve her health and appearance. He spoke at length about the benefits of proper medicine, about how women of her profession could extend their working years and increase their earnings through attention to their physical well-being. Matilda listened with the scepticism of one who had heard many promises from men who claimed to offer help. She had little faith in doctors, having encountered several who had treated women of her profession with contempt or who had demanded sexual favours as payment for their services. But Cream was persistent, and the pills cost her nothing. He placed them on her table, counted out 6 white tablets, explained that she should take 2 each evening before bed. They contained nothing harmful, he assured her, merely compounds that would purify her blood, strengthen her constitution, improve the quality of her skin. She could take them or not as she chose, but he believed they would benefit her, and as a physician he felt a duty to offer assistance where he could. The transaction that followed was brief and mechanical, notable only for Cream's apparent distraction. He seemed more interested in ensuring that Matilda understood the instructions for taking the pills than in the service for which he was ostensibly paying. He departed after less than an hour, leaving her with the agreed-upon payment and repeated reminders about the medicine he had provided. She locked the door behind him, placed the coins in her tin box, looked at the pills still sitting on her table. She did not take them that night. Years of survival had taught her caution, and accepting medicine from strangers ran counter to every instinct she had developed. She placed the pills in a drawer and forgot about them for several days, during which time her business continued as usual. She received clients, earned money, paid her rent, maintained the routine that structured her existence. The weather grew colder, and her coal supply diminished. She considered purchasing more fuel, but decided against the expense, reasoning that winter was still young, and she would need to preserve her resources for the worse weather that would come in January and February. Dr. Neill returned on the last day of November, appearing at her door in the early evening, without prior arrangement. Matilda was surprised but allowed him entry. He had paid well on his previous visit and shown no signs of violence. He inquired whether she had been taking the pills he had provided, seemed disappointed when she admitted she had not, became insistent that she do so immediately. They would help her, he repeated. They would make her stronger, healthier, more attractive to potential clients. As a physician, he could guarantee their efficacy. Something in his insistence troubled her, but he was standing in her room and declining would require asking him to leave, which might cost her future business with a reliable client. She retrieved the pills from the drawer, accepted the glass of water he poured for her from her own pitcher, placed 2 tablets on her tongue, and swallowed. He watched with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on her throat as if he could observe the pills descending into her stomach. He seemed satisfied once she had completed this action, became more relaxed, engaged her in the conversation about her origins and history. He stayed longer than before, speaking more than most of her clients did, asking questions that seemed strange in their specificity. He wanted to know about her daily routine, about which public houses she frequented, about whether she had family in London who might visit her or inquire after her welfare. She answered vaguely, uncomfortable with the direction of his curiosity, but unsure how to refuse without giving offence. Finally, he departed, leaving payment that was generous enough to quiet her concerns. She locked the door, banked the fire, prepared for sleep. The first symptoms appeared within an hour. She felt a tightness in her stomach, a sensation not quite pain but definitely unpleasant. She attributed it to hunger. She had not eaten since morning, and considered going out to purchase food. But the cold outside was severe, and the hour was late, and the sensation was not quite bad enough to warrant the effort. She lay down instead, pulling the blankets over herself, seeking warmth and rest. The tightness intensified, spreading from her stomach throughout her torso. Her muscles began to feel strange, as if they were contracting without her willing them to do so. She tried to relax, to breathe deeply, but found that her chest would not expand properly. Panic touched her then, the recognition that something was profoundly wrong, that this was not hunger or indigestion, but something far more serious. She attempted to rise from the bed, thinking she should seek help, but her legs would not support her. She fell heavily, striking her shoulder against the chest of drawers, crying out from the pain. The convulsions began moments later. Her back arched violently, muscles contracting with force that felt as if her spine would snap. Her jaw locked shut, her teeth grinding together, her tongue caught between them. Blood filled her mouth, hot and metallic, choking her. Her arms and legs thrashed against the floor, striking furniture, bruising flesh against wood and metal. She could not control these movements, could not stop her body from destroying itself. The pain was absolute, overwhelming, beyond anything she could have imagined, as if every nerve in her body were being burned simultaneously. She tried to scream but produced only strangled gasps. Her throat had closed, the muscles contracting so tightly that air could barely pass. Her lungs heaved uselessly, seeking oxygen that would not come. Her vision narrowed to a small tunnel of light, then to nothing at all. She was drowning in air, suffocating in her own room, dying on her floor while the coal fire burned low and the gas lamp on the wall flickered. The convulsions came in waves, each lasting perhaps a minute, followed by brief periods of relative calm during which her body lay exhausted and trembling. During these intermissions, some portion of her consciousness returned, enough to recognize that she was dying, enough to understand that the pills had done this to her, enough to curse the man who had given them to her. But she could not form these thoughts into words, could not call for help, could not do anything but lie waiting for the next wave to strike. The third convulsion killed her. Her heart, strained beyond endurance by the repeated muscle contractions, simply stopped. The electrical impulses that had driven it for 27 years ceased firing. The blood stopped flowing. The brain, deprived of oxygen, began dying immediately, its cells collapsing one by one, all consciousness extinguishing like candles in a sudden wind. Matilda Clover died sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock on the evening of November 30th, in her rented room on Lambeth Road, alone and in agony. Her body remained on the floor throughout the night, cooling slowly in the unheated room, stiffening into the contorted position in which death had found her. The fire burned down to ash. The gas lamp exhausted its supply and went dark. The building around her was silent, its other occupants either absent or asleep or simply indifferent to whatever sounds might have escaped her room during those final minutes. Morning came late in December, the sun rising after 8 o'clock, its light weak and grey. The landlord, making his rounds to collect rents due on the 1st of the month, knocked on Matilda's door and received no answer. He knocked again, more loudly, then used his key to enter. He found her body immediately lying near the door where she had fallen, her face frozen in that terrible grin that strychnine produced, her eyes open and staring at nothing. He sent for the police, who arrived within the hour. The constable who attended made the same assessment that had been made in Ellen Donworth's case. A prostitute, dead in her room, no obvious signs of violence, likely an overdose or natural causes related to her profession and lifestyle. The police surgeon who examined the body several hours later concurred. The woman had clearly suffered violent convulsions before death, which suggested either epilepsy or the delirium tremens associated with chronic alcoholism. Given her profession and the circumstances in which she lived, alcoholism seemed the more likely explanation. The inquest was perfunctory. No one appeared to claim relationship with the deceased or to contest the medical findings. The landlord testified that she had paid her rent regularly and caused no disturbances. A woman who had known her slightly testified that Matilda drank but no more than most women in their profession, that she had seemed in reasonable health, that her death was unexpected but not shocking given the general precariousness of their existence. The jury returned a verdict of death by natural causes, specifically alcoholic poisoning leading to delirium tremens and subsequent heart failure. Matilda Clover was buried in the same cemetery as Ellen Donworth, in another unmarked grave, another forgotten casualty of Victorian London's underclass. The room on Lamberton Road was cleaned and re-let within the week. Her few possessions were sold to pay outstanding debts. The photograph on the mantel, the china dog, the tin containing her savings, all disappeared into the anonymous circulation of the second-hand markets. Within a month, no physical trace remained that she had ever existed. No letters arrived at Scotland Yard about her death. No accusations were made. No demands for investigation. The file containing the letters about Ellen Donworth remained closed, gathering dust in its cabinet. The two deaths were not connected because no one knew they needed connecting. They were simply two more casualties among the thousands who died each year in London, unremarkable except to themselves, forgotten almost before they were born, and Thomas Neill Cream departed England on the 5th of December, travelling first to France and then across the Atlantic to Canada. He would remain abroad for nearly 4 months, his absence from London corresponding exactly with a period during which no suspicious deaths occurred among the prostitutes of Lambeth. No mysterious letters arrived at Scotland Yard. No accusations disturbed the peaceful operations of Victorian justice. It was a coincidence that would only become significant much later, when patterns finally emerged from what had seemed like random events, when connections were made that should have been obvious from the beginning, but which had been obscured by the fog of class prejudice and official indifference that surrounded the deaths of poor women in the imperial capital. Chapter 6. The American Interlude. The Atlantic crossing in December was brutal, the winter storms that swept across the northern sea route, making the voyage a trial of endurance for even experienced travellers. The steamship on which Cream sailed pitched and rolled through waves that rose higher than the ship's main deck, driven by winds that shrieked through the rigging like the voices of the damned. Most passengers remained in their cabins, prostrate with seasickness, emerging only when the ship reached calmer waters near the Canadian coast. Cream spent the voyage in apparent comfort, immune to the motion that devastated others, taking his meals in the dining saloon while chairs and dishes slid across the floor, reading in his cabin while the ship groaned and shuddered around him. He disembarked at Halifax on the 18th of December, passed through customs with the ease of a gentleman travelling for pleasure, boarded a train that carried him west across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick into Quebec. The Canadian winter had arrived early that year, the landscape visible through the train windows transformed into a monochrome study of white snow and black trees, the small towns through which they passed looking as if they had been carved from ice. He reached Montreal on the 20th, took rooms at a hotel near the city centre, and settled in as if he intended an extended stay. Montreal knew Thomas Neill Cream, though not pleasantly. He had been born across the river in Quebec City, the son of a ship's manager who had emigrated from Scotland in the 1830s. The family had prospered modestly, achieving the comfortable respectability that was possible for skilled Protestant immigrants in a province dominated by French Catholics. Cream had received education superior to his class, studying at McGill University, where he earned his medical degree, then continuing his education in Edinburgh and London before returning to Montreal to establish a practice. That practice had been brief and troubled. Rumours circulated about his treatment of female patients, about procedures performed in his consulting rooms that had nothing to do with legitimate medicine, about young women who entered healthy and left damaged. One woman, a waitress named Flora Brooks, had died under mysterious circumstances after visiting his office. An inquest had been held, questions asked, but nothing could be proven, and Cream had left for the United States before more serious investigation could proceed. That had been 13 years earlier, and Montreal had largely forgotten him, or at least forgotten the specific details of his disgrace. He spent Christmas in Montreal, attending church services with the apparent devotion of a respectable Presbyterian, dining at his hotel, walking the snow-covered streets in the brief daylight hours. He visited the university, wandering its halls like an alumnus seeking connection with his past. He made inquiries about old classmates, learned that some had prospered while others had failed, that the medical profession in Montreal was thriving as the city grew and modernized. He gave no indication of his activities in London, made no mention of the deaths that had preceded his departure, presented himself as a physician who had spent years in America and was now considering returning to Canada to re-establish his career. After New Year, he travelled to Quebec City, the place of his birth, where his father still lived in retirement. The reunion was cold, the old man having long since concluded that his son was a disgrace to the family name. They spoke briefly, maintained the minimal civility that familial obligation required, parted with mutual relief. Cream remained in Quebec City only 2 days before returning to Montreal, where he spent the remainder of January in apparent idleness, visiting public houses and theatres, attending lectures at medical societies, observing the city but not engaging with it in any meaningful way. In early February he departed for the United States, crossing the border into New York State, travelling by rail to Chicago. Here he had spent significant time in the previous decade. Here he had practiced medicine of a sort. Here he had been imprisoned for 4 years after a conviction for poisoning. The details of that case remained sealed in court records. A husband dead of strychnine poisoning, Cream, connected to both the victim and the victim's wife, evidence sufficient for conviction, but ambiguous enough that some believed him innocent, railroaded by prosecutors eager to close a difficult case. He had been released from Joliet Prison just over a year earlier, in July of 1891, after serving his full sentence minus time for good behaviour. The prison authorities had noted him as a model prisoner, quiet and well-behaved, working in the prison hospital where his medical knowledge made him useful. He had shown no signs of the violence or madness that might have been expected from someone convicted of murder. He had simply served his time, accepted his release, and disappeared into the wider world with no indication of what he intended to do with his restored freedom. Chicago in February was as cold as Montreal, but dirtier. The snow that fell quickly turning grey with coal smoke and industrial effluent. The streets churned into frozen mud by the constant traffic of wagons and streetcars. The city had grown enormously in the 2 decades since the Great Fire, spreading outward in all directions, its population swelling with immigrants from Europe and migrants from rural America seeking opportunity in the industrial metropolis. It was a place of raw energy and casual violence, where fortunes were made and lost with equal rapidity, where the gap between wealth and poverty was as stark as anywhere on earth. Cream took rooms in a boarding house on the south side, in a neighbourhood that had deteriorated since his previous residence there. He made no attempt to re-establish a medical practice, sought out none of his former associates, behaved like a man in hiding though, from what or whom remained unclear. He spent his days reading newspapers in public libraries, his evenings walking the streets, observing the city's underworld with the same careful attention he'd given to Lambeth. The prostitutes here were different from their London counterparts, more open in their solicitation, less constrained by the elaborate code of respectability that governed even vice in Victorian England. They worked saloons and dance halls rather than street corners, operated under the protection of political machines that controlled their territories with the efficiency of military occupation. He approached several of these women, engaged them in conversation, offered drinks and small sums of money without demanding services in return. He asked them about their health, their habits, their use of medicine and drugs. Some found his interest creepy and refused further contact. Others, desperate for any source of income, tolerated his peculiar questions and accepted whatever money he offered. None died during his Chicago sojourn. Whatever impulse drove him to murder remained dormant, or perhaps the conditions necessary for its expression did not exist away from London. He stayed in Chicago through March, the winter gradually releasing its grip, the frozen mud of the streets becoming liquid mud, or the temperature rising enough that standing outside became tolerable. He seemed to be waiting for something, though what remained unclear even to those few people with whom he had limited contact. His landlady noticed that he received no mail, had no visitors, spent most of his time alone in his room or wandering the city. She would later remember him as a quiet tenant who paid his rent on time and caused no trouble, though there was something about him she found unsettling, some quality she could not articulate but which made her uncomfortable when she encountered him in the hallways. In early April he departed abruptly, settling his account, packing his belongings, leaving no forwarding address. Dean. He travelled north by train, crossing back into Canada, making his way to the Atlantic ports. He booked passage on a steamship departing Halifax for Liverpool, the same route he had travelled in reverse 4 months earlier. The spring crossing was less brutal than the winter voyage had been, though still uncomfortable, the North Atlantic in April being cold and rough, the fog banks thick and dangerous for navigation. He arrived in Liverpool on the 23rd of April, passed through British customs, travelled immediately by rail to London. He reached the capital on the evening of the 24th, emerging from Euston Station into streets that were experiencing the tentative warmth of early spring. The trees were beginning to leaf, the days were growing longer. The winter's cold smoke was dissipating enough that the sun occasionally broke through the perpetual overcast. London was stirring from its winter torpor. The populace venturing out in greater numbers, the commerce of the city accelerating as warmer weather permitted more outdoor activity. Cream took rooms at 103 Westminster Bridge Road, not far from his previous lodgings but in a slightly different location, as if he believed that changing addresses might somehow protect him from connection to his earlier activities. The building was similar to the previous one, a respectable boarding house catering to professional men of moderate means, well maintained but not luxurious, offering privacy and anonymity to those who desired it. He settled in quickly, unpacking the possessions he had carried across the Atlantic and back, arranging his room with the same methodical care he had shown on his first arrival in London the previous autumn. The women who worked the streets around Waterloo Bridge had noticed his absence during the winter months, though they could not have said specifically when he had disappeared or when he returned. He was simply there again, the gentleman in the silk hat walking the streets in the evening, buying drinks in public houses, speaking with them in his courteous way, offering small kindnesses without obvious motive. Some remembered him more clearly than others, those who had spoken with him multiple times, those who had been struck by his peculiar questions about their health and habits. But memory among their population was short, focused on the present and the immediate future rather than the past. Yesterday's clients were forgotten as soon as payment was received. Only unusual events or particularly violent men remained in memory. And this doctor, with his gentle manner and educated speech, did not qualify as either. He had been gone 4 months. In that time, no suspicious deaths had occurred among the prostitutes of Lambeth. No mysterious letters had arrived at Scotland Yard. No accusations had disturbed the orderly operation of the inquest system. It had been a quiet winter, notable only for being unremarkable. But now it was spring, and Thomas Neill Cream had returned, and the pattern that had been interrupted in December was about to resume with a violence that would finally force the authorities to recognise what they should have seen from the beginning, that something monstrous walked among them, that the deaths they had dismissed as natural were nothing of the kind, that the fog which obscured London's streets also obscured a truth too terrible for official minds to contemplate until it could no longer be denied. Chapter 7. Return to the Thames. Spring arrived in London with the hesitation characteristic of northern climates, the weather alternating between brief warm spells and sudden returns to winter cold, the rain falling more frequently than during the frozen months, but without the intensity that would come in summer. The Thames ran high with meltwater from upstream, its current swift and dangerous, the colour changing from winter grey to the particular brown-green that indicated increased flow from the countryside. The trees in the parks and squares produced their first leaves, pale green and fragile, while the flowers that had survived beneath the snow began pushing through the thawing earth. The city responded to the changing season with visible relief. The consumption of coal decreased as heating fires became less necessary, allowing the perpetual smoke that hung over London to thin somewhat, permitting sunlight to reach street level with greater frequency. The markets filled with spring vegetables brought from Kent and Surrey, the first strawberries appearing in late April, expensive but available for those who could afford such luxuries. The streets became more crowded as people emerged from winter hibernation, the traffic of omnibuses and cabs increasing, the pavements thronged with pedestrians conducting business or simply walking for pleasure in the improved weather. Thomas Neill Cream resumed his routine as if the 4-month interruption had never occurred. He walked the streets of Lambeth and Westminster, his stick tapping against the pavement, his eyes observing everything with that peculiar intensity that marked him. He frequented the same public houses he had visited the previous autumn, took the same corners at certain times of day, established himself as a regular presence in the district. The barmen and landlords who saw him regularly came to recognise him, to nod in greeting, to remember his preference for whisky taken neat rather than diluted with water. He had money during this period, more than his moderate lodgings and simple lifestyle required. He had inherited a substantial sum following his father's death, while he was in prison. The old man, having been unable to entirely disinherit a son despite profound disapproval of his character and conduct, the inheritance had been held in trust during his imprisonment, released to him upon his discharge, providing him with an income sufficient to live comfortably without working. This financial independence allowed him to present himself as a gentleman of leisure, a physician who had retired from active practice, a man of education and culture pursuing his interests in the great metropolis. Those interests remained what they had been, an obsessive focus on the prostitutes who worked the streets south of the Thames, and an equally obsessive need to communicate with authorities through anonymous letters that mixed accusation with demand, revelation with concealment. He had resumed writing these letters almost immediately upon his return to London, posting them from different locations throughout the city, varying his handwriting slightly though not enough to disguise that they came from the same source. The letters went to coroners and magistrates, to newspaper editors and members of Parliament, to physicians and police officials, each containing claims of murder, each naming different individuals as perpetrators, each demanding investigation or payment or both. Scotland Yard had accumulated nearly 24 such letters in the file that now bore Cream's name, though they did not yet know his name and had no reason to connect the letters to any specific individual. The detectives who reviewed them periodically noted their persistence, their peculiar mixture of knowledge and delusion, their author's apparent obsession with the deaths of prostitutes, but nothing in the letters provided actionable evidence. They named individuals who could prove their innocence easily. They made claims that investigation showed to be false. They seemed to be the work of someone who knew certain facts about deaths in Lambeth, but who either deliberately obscured the truth or was genuinely deluded about who was responsible. What the police did not recognise was that the letters served multiple purposes for their author. They allowed Cream to relive his crimes by writing about them, to experience again the sense of power that came from causing death. They allowed him to toy with authority, to demonstrate his superiority by placing evidence before officials who remained too blind or too incompetent to interpret it correctly. And they allowed him to deflect suspicion by naming others as guilty, by creating confusion and misdirection, by ensuring that if investigation did occur, it would pursue false leads rather than true ones. The women he had killed before his departure, Ellen Donworth and Matilda Clover, remained buried in their unmarked graves, their deaths recorded in official registers as natural causes, their lives forgotten except by the few who had known them slightly and who thought of them rarely if at all. The women who continued working the streets around Waterloo had no reason to connect those deaths with the gentlemen who approached them now in the spring warmth, who bought them drinks and spoke to them with such courtesy, who offered pills that he claimed would improve their health and appearance. Emma Shrivell was 21, dark-haired and still possessing enough youth that she could command better prices than older women. She shared rooms with Alice Marsh in Orient Buildings, a relatively new construction that had been intended as model housing for respectable workers, but which had quickly become home to those on the margins of respectability. The two women had known each other for several years, had worked together long enough to develop the trust necessary for such an arrangement, looked out for each other in ways that provided protection against some of the dangers their profession entailed. Alice Marsh was slightly older, 24, and had been working the streets longer. She was the more cautious of the two, more sceptical of clients who seemed too friendly or too generous, more alert to the signs that indicated potential danger. But even her caution had limits, and a gentleman who had been present in the district for months, who had shown no signs of violence, who paid well and treated them respectfully, such a man seemed safe enough to trust. Cream approached them in mid-April, encountering them together on the corner where Westminster Bridge Road met York Road, the junction busy with evening traffic. He raised his hat, expressed pleasure at finding them, suggested they might join him for drinks at a nearby public house. They accepted, having learned that time spent drinking with a client often resulted in higher payment when the transaction finally occurred, the alcohol loosening inhibitions and wallets alike. He bought several rounds, engaged them in conversation that seemed genuinely interested in their lives and opinions, created an atmosphere of camaraderie that made the eventual negotiation of terms almost friendly. He accompanied them back to their rooms around 10 o'clock, walking between them, his manner suggesting three friends out for an evening rather than a commercial transaction in progress. Orient Buildings was better maintained than many of the structures housing prostitutes, its central courtyard lit by gas lamps, its staircases reasonably clean, its residents more employed than criminal. Emma and Alice's rooms were on the third floor, two small spaces connected by a doorway, allowing them to share facilities while maintaining separate sleeping and working areas. In Emma's room, with the gas lit and the window open to admit the spring air, Cream produced his pills. He had refined his presentation over the course of 3 murders, had learned which approaches worked best, which words convinced sceptical women to accept medicine from strangers. He spoke of the importance of health to their profession, of how small interventions now could prevent larger problems later, of his desire as a physician to help women who had little access to proper medical care. He produced testimonials from women he claimed to have treated, though the names were inventions and the women did not exist. He made the pills seem like valuable medicine that he was providing from generosity rather than self-interest. Emma was more easily convinced than Alice, who watched the proceedings with visible skepticism. But when Emma agreed to take the pills, Alice's resistance crumbled. If her friend and roommate was willing to trust this doctor, then perhaps her caution was excessive. They each accepted 2 tablets, swallowed them with water from the pitcher that sat on Emma's washstand, thanked him for his kindness. Cream watched with that intense focus that should have alarmed them, but which they interpreted as professional interest. A doctor observing the effects of medicine he had prescribed. The transaction that followed was awkward, both women feeling increasingly unwell, their stomachs churning, their muscles beginning to twitch involuntarily. Cream seemed not to notice their distress, or perhaps he noticed but found satisfaction in it. He paid them the agreed amount, gathered his things, prepared to depart. As he reached the door, Emma gasped, her hand going to her throat. Alice looked at her in alarm, then back at Cream, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. He left quickly, his footsteps rapid on the stairs, disappearing into the spring evening. Behind him, in the 3rd floor room, 2 women began to die. Chapter 8. A double horror. The convulsions took them simultaneously, as if their bodies were synchronized instruments responding to the same terrible conductor. Emma collapsed first, her legs folding beneath her, her body striking the floor with force, sufficient to rattle the furniture. Alice watched for perhaps 3 seconds, frozen in incomprehension, before her own muscles began their violent rebellion. She reached for the door, thinking perhaps to call for help, but her hand would not obey her will. Instead, it clawed at the air, fingers curling into a rigid claw, the arm drawing back against her chest as if pulled by invisible wires. The screaming began then, though it was not precisely screaming. The throat muscles contracted too severely to permit proper vocalization. What emerged were strangled gasps and guttural moans, sounds more animal than human, sounds that spoke of suffering beyond the capacity of language to express. The other residents of Orient buildings heard these sounds, muffled by walls and doors, but none recognised them for what they were. London was never silent, even at night. The sounds of distress were common enough. Domestic disputes, drunken arguments, the various scizzories that accompanied poverty and vice. One learned to ignore such things, to mind one's own affairs, to avoid becoming entangled in the troubles of neighbours. Emma's body arched impossibly, her spine curving backward until her head nearly touched her heels, held in that position by muscles contracting with force, sufficient to fracture bone. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, her jaw locked open, foam gathering at the corners of her mouth. The small room that had been her refuge, the space she had tried to make comfortable with a few cheap decorations and carefully mended curtains, became a torture chamber. Her consciousness fragmented, unable to process the totality of agony that engulfed her. Thoughts came in flashes. The pills, the doctor, something wrong, help needed, dying mother, darkness. Alice had fallen near the doorway that connected the 2 rooms, her body blocking the passage. She had tried to reach the corridor, some instinct suggesting that help lay beyond the walls of this room, but her legs had failed and she had gone down hard. The convulsions lifted her from the floor, her back arching, her limbs flailing, striking the doorframe and the walls. Blood appeared on her forehead where she had struck the wooden door jamb, ran down into her eyes, blinding her. Not that vision mattered now. The world had contracted to a single point of absolute suffering, everything else obliterated by pain. The strychnine that Thomas Neill Cream had given them was working exactly as he knew it would. He understood the mechanism intimately, had studied it during his medical training, had observed it in animals during his experiments, had witnessed it in humans on multiple occasions. Strychnine interfered with the nervous system's ability to regulate muscle contraction, blocking the neurotransmitters that normally prevented muscles from contracting all at once. The result was tetanic seizure, every muscle in the body contracting simultaneously and with maximum force, the body literally tearing itself apart from within. Death from strychnine was not quick, despite what those unfamiliar with the poison might imagine. The convulsions came in waves, each lasting 1 to 2 minutes, followed by brief periods of exhaustion during which the body lay trembling, and the consciousness returned enough to anticipate the next wave with terror. A strong person might survive 5 or 6 such cycles before the heart gave out or the respiratory muscles failed permanently. Emma and Alice, young but malnourished, weakened by the demands of their profession and the general hardship of their lives, would not last so long. Emma's second convulsion struck 5 minutes after the first. Her body, having barely relaxed from the previous spasm, snapped rigid again, the muscles contracting even more violently than before. Something in her back made a sound like greenwood breaking, a crack audible even over her strangled breathing. The pain of this new injury added to the general agony, though it was difficult to say whether she could distinguish one source of suffering from another. Her bladder released, urine spreading across the floor, mixing with the blood from where she had bitten through her tongue, creating a small pool that reflected the gaslight in its surface. Alice's consciousness was leaving her, the brain unable to maintain function under such extreme conditions. She was aware of Emma's presence, aware that her friend was suffering the same fate, aware in some distant way that they were dying together as they had lived together. But these thoughts came without emotion, stripped of everything but bare recognition. Her vision had narrowed to a grey tunnel, the edges closing in, the light at the centre dimming. She could still hear, or thought she could hear, but the sounds were distorted, stretched and compressed like music played at wrong speeds. The room reeked of sweat and urine and blood and the peculiar smell that accompanied extreme physical distress. A scent that was almost metallic. The body's chemistry gone wrong, manifesting as odour. The gas lamp on the wall burned steadily, indifferent to the horror it illuminated, the yellow light casting shadows that jumped and moved as the women's bodies convulsed. Outside the window, the spring evening continued its peaceful progress toward night. Stars became visible in the darkening sky. The traffic noise from the surrounding streets gradually diminished as businesses closed and people retired to their homes. The city's day was ending in the ordinary way, untroubled by the fact that 2 of its inhabitants were experiencing deaths of extraordinary cruelty in a small room that no one important would ever visit or remember. Emma died first, during her 4th convulsion. Her heart, strained beyond endurance by the repeated massive muscle contractions, stopped beating. The electrical impulses that had maintained its rhythm for 21 years simply ceased. Blood stopped flowing. The brain, already oxygen deprived from the respiratory distress, began dying immediately. Her body, frozen in its final spasm, remained rigid for several minutes after death. The muscles locked in contraction even though the nervous system that commanded them had shut down. When the muscles finally relaxed, the body collapsed into an unnatural posture, limbs bent at wrong angles, the face still bearing that terrible grin that strychnine produced. Alice survived another 10 minutes, her body fighting with desperate determination against the poison destroying it. She experienced 2 more full convulsions, each weaker than the previous, the body's resources exhausted, the muscles no longer able to generate the force they had produced earlier. Between the convulsions she lay still, her breathing shallow and irregular, her heart beating arrhythmically, skipping beats and racing and slowing in random patterns. Some part of her mind understood that Emma was dead, that she would follow shortly, that the man who had done this to them had walked away free and would face no consequences. This knowledge, bitter and absolute, was her last conscious thought before the darkness took her. She died at approximately 11 o'clock, more than an hour after swallowing the pills. Her death was quieter than Emma's, a gradual cessation rather than a violent ending. The heart simply stopped trying, the lungs stopped attempting to draw breath, the brain released its hold on consciousness and slipped into the void from which there was no return. Her body relaxed into stillness, the expression on her face not the rictus grin that marked Emma's corpse, but something almost peaceful, as if death had been a relief after the torments that preceded it. The 2 women lay dead in the connected rooms of their shared lodging, their bodies twisted and broken, their cheap possessions scattered around them, their lives ended for no reason except that they had encountered a man who killed because he enjoyed killing, because he could, because the structure of society was such that women of their class could be murdered without anyone caring enough to stop him. They would be found in the morning by the landlord, who would call the police, who would make the same assumptions they had made about Ellen Donworth and Matilda Clover. Prostitutes, probably drunk or drugged, deaths unfortunate but not surprising, no reason to suspect foul play. But this time would be different. This time there were 2 bodies instead of 1, both showing the same signs of violent convulsion, both dying on the same night in the same location, both having been seen earlier in the evening with the same man. This time witnesses would remember the gentleman in the silk hat, would recall his insistence that the women accompany him, would note that he had produced something for them to swallow. This time the coincidence would be too obvious to ignore, the pattern too clear to dismiss as natural causes or accident. The night advanced toward morning. The gas lamps in Orient buildings burned through their scheduled hours, then were extinguished by the automatic timers that controlled them, plunging the hallways into darkness. The courtyard fell silent as the last residents returned home or settled into sleep. The city's background noise diminished to the minimum that London never fell below. The distant rumble of late trains, the occasional hansom cab clattering over cobblestones, the barking of dogs, the cries of infants, the perpetual susurrus of 8 million people breathing and dreaming and dying in close proximity. In his rooms on Westminster Bridge Road, Thomas Neill Cream sat at his table and composed another letter. He wrote slowly, carefully, the pen scratching across good quality paper, the words emerging in his precise copperplate script. He was writing to a prominent physician, accusing him of supplying the poison that had killed 2 prostitutes that very evening. The accusation was elaborate and specific, naming times and locations, describing the transaction in detail, demanding that the physician be arrested and charged with double murder. That the physician in question had no connection to prostitutes, no access to strychnine, and an alibi that could be verified by dozens of witnesses did not trouble Cream. The point was not to secure anyone's conviction. The point was to create chaos, to manipulate the investigation, to demonstrate his own superiority by leading the authorities wherever he chose, while they remained blind to the truth that walked among them. He finished the letter as dawn approached, sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to carefully. He would post it later in the day, from a location far from his lodgings, taking care not to be observed. Then he would wait to see how the authorities responded, whether they would finally begin to understand what should have been obvious from the beginning, or whether they would continue stumbling through their investigation like blind men in a fog-bound street, reaching towards the truth but never quite grasping it. The sun rose over London, pale and weak, the spring morning bringing with it the promise of warmth that would arrive later in the day. The city stirred to life, the early workers emerging from their homes, the street vendors setting up their stalls, the omnibuses beginning their routes. In Orient buildings, the landlord climbed the stairs to collect rents that were overdue, knocked on the door of the third-floor rooms, received no answer, used his key to enter, and discovered what Thomas Neill Cream had wrought. Chapter 9. The Trap Closes. The discovery of 2 bodies transformed what had been a series of isolated incidents into a matter demanding immediate and serious attention. The constable who responded to the landlord's summons understood immediately that this was not a routine death. 2 women, young and recently healthy according to witnesses, dead in identical circumstances, their bodies exhibiting signs of violent poisoning. This was murder, and murder of a particularly cold-blooded sort. He secured the scene, prevented the landlord from disturbing anything further, sent immediately for detectives from Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department. Inspector George Harvey arrived within 2 hours, accompanied by 2 detective sergeants and a police surgeon. Harvey was 45 years old, a career policeman who had risen through the ranks on the basis of competence rather than connections, a man who approached investigation with methodical thoroughness rather than intuitive brilliance. He had worked numerous murder cases during his 20 years with the Metropolitan Police, had seen bodies in every condition that violence or accident could produce, but something about the scene in Orient buildings struck him as particularly disturbing. The bodies had stiffened into the contorted positions in which death had found them, the rigor mortis locking them into permanent testimony of their suffering. The police surgeon, Dr. Thomas Stevenson, examined them carefully, noting the signs that indicated strychnine poisoning, the risus sardonicus, the arched backs, the evidence of tetanic convulsions so violent that muscles had torn and bones had cracked. He had seen strychnine deaths before, usually suicides who had mistaken the poison for something less agonizing, occasionally accidents involving rat poison. But 2 simultaneous deaths from strychnine, in women who had no obvious reason to have access to such poison, suggested deliberate murder. Harvey began taking statements from the other residents of Orient buildings, working through the long list of tenants systematically. Most had heard nothing or chose to claim they had heard nothing, unwilling to involve themselves in police matters. But a few had noticed things. A gentleman leaving the building around 10 o'clock, well-dressed, wearing a silk hat moving quickly down the stairs. A woman who lived on the second floor had seen Emma and Alice earlier, in the evening, walking with a man who matched this description, all three apparently in good spirits. Another tenant had encountered the same man on previous occasions, remembered him because his appearance was incongruous with the building's general character. Too well dressed, too obviously prosperous to be visiting Orient buildings for any legitimate reason. The investigation expanded outward from this initial information. Harvey sent men to question the prostitutes who worked the nearby streets, asking about a gentleman in a silk hat, a man who approached working women, a doctor who gave pills. The responses came quickly. Yes, they knew such a man. He had been around for months. He called himself Dr. Neill, or sometimes Dr. Neill. He claimed to be a physician. He was generous with drinks and small amounts of money. He had given some of them pills that he said would improve their health. Several women produced pills they had received but not taken, their caution or suspicion having prevented them from swallowing medicine from a stranger. Harvey seized these pills, sent them to Dr. Stevenson for analysis. The laboratory examination confirmed what the symptoms had already suggested. The pills contained strychnine in quantities sufficient to kill. They had been professionally compounded, pressed into uniform tablets, coated to disguise their bitter taste. This was not crude rat poison, but pharmaceutical-grade strychnine, obtained from legitimate sources, prepared by someone with chemical knowledge and access to proper equipment. The investigation's focus shifted immediately to identifying the source of the poison. Detectives visited every chemist's shop in Lambeth and Westminster, examining poison registers, looking for recent purchases of strychnine by individuals who matched the description of Dr. Neill. The search proved frustrating initially. Strychnine was commonly available for legitimate purposes. The registers contained hundreds of entries, and the descriptions provided were too vague to eliminate most purchasers. But persistence produced results. A chemist on Parliament Street recalled selling strychnine to a gentleman who matched the description, a man who had presented himself as a physician requiring the substance for the medical experiments. The chemist had recorded the sale as required by the law, noting the purchaser's name and address: Thomas Neill, 103 Westminster Bridge Road. Harvey and his men descended on the address immediately, only to find that Cream had anticipated them. His room was empty, his belongings removed, his rent paid through the end of the week, but no indication of where he had gone. The landlady could provide little useful information. He had been a quiet tenant, kept regular hours, received no mail, had no visitors. She had noticed nothing suspicious about him, certainly nothing that would suggest he was a murderer. He had left 2 days after the deaths in Orient buildings, telling her he was travelling to the continent for several weeks, asking her to hold the room for his return. But Cream had made a crucial mistake, one that would ultimately prove fatal to his freedom. He had continued writing his letters, and the letters provided evidence that their author possessed knowledge only the murderer could have. A letter arrived at Scotland Yard 3 days after the discovery of the bodies, accusing a Dr. William Harper of supplying the poison that killed Emma Shrivel and Alice Marsh. The letter contained details about the deaths that had not been released to the press, the precise time they had occurred, the symptoms they had exhibited, the fact that they had taken pills given to them by a man claiming to be a physician. The letter demanded that Harper be arrested immediately, threatened to expose the whole scandal to the newspapers unless the police acted. Dr. Harper was interviewed and easily cleared of suspicion. He was a respectable physician, with a large practice in Bloomsbury, had never visited Lambeth, had never prescribed strychnine to anyone, could account for his whereabouts on the night of the murders with multiple witnesses, but the letter itself became evidence. Its author clearly knew facts about the crime that had not been made public, which meant he was either the murderer or someone with direct knowledge of the murders. The handwriting matched the letters that had been accumulating in Scotland Yard's files for months, the letters about Ellen Donworth's death, the letters that had seemed like the ravings of a madman, but which now appeared in a different light. Harvey obtained a warrant to search Cream's room at Westminster Bridge Road more thoroughly. The landlady admitted the police, and a careful examination of the premises produced several items of interest. Books on toxicology with passages about strychnine marked, a notebook containing names and addresses of prostitutes who worked in Lambeth, a drafts of letters in handwriting that matched the anonymous correspondence Scotland Yard had been receiving. More significantly, they found a photograph, cabinet card showing a man in his early 40s, well-dressed, wearing a silk hat, his face showing the cold arrogance that some photographers managed to capture despite their subjects' attempts to present agreeable expressions. The landlady confirmed that this was her former tenant, Thomas Neill Cream. The photograph was shown to witnesses who identified it as the man who'd been seen with Emma Shrivel and Alice Marsh on the night of their deaths, the man who'd been giving pills to prostitutes throughout the district, the gentleman in the silk hat who'd been a familiar presence on the streets around Waterloo for nearly 6 months. An alert was issued for his arrest. His description circulated to ports and railway stations, and inquiries sent to police forces throughout boroughs of Britain and to authorities on the continent. But Cream's whereabouts remained unknown. He had left his lodgings and disappeared into the vast anonymity that London afforded to those who wished to avoid detection. Harvey had to consider the possibility that he had fled to the continent or returned to America, that he might never be apprehended, that the investigation would end in frustration despite having identified the murderer. The newspapers had gotten hold of the story by now and were publishing lurid accounts of the Lambeth Poisoner, the doctor who killed prostitutes for reasons the press could only speculate about wildly and sensationally. What the investigation had not yet discovered was that Cream had not fled far at all. He had taken new lodgings in South London, just a few streets away from his previous residence, had changed his appearance slightly by shaving his moustache and adopting spectacles, and had resumed his routine of walking the streets and observing the progress of the investigation with obvious satisfaction. His arrogance was so profound that he believed himself untouchable, convinced that the police were too incompetent to capture him even when they knew his name and had his description. But arrogance breeds carelessness, and Cream's need to remain close to the investigation, to observe its progress, to insert himself into the narrative, would prove his undoing. He began approaching people with information about the murders, presenting himself as someone with special knowledge, hinting that he knew the identity of the killer. He showed witnesses photographs he claimed were of the murderer, photographs that were actually of prominent physicians he hoped to implicate in the crimes. He wrote more letters, even more elaborate and accusatory, demanding money in exchange for withholding evidence that he claimed would prove certain respectable individuals guilty of the poisonings. One of these approaches brought him to the attention of a private detective named John Haynes, hired by one of the men Cream had been attempting to blackmail. Haynes, a former police officer with extensive experience in criminal investigation, recognized immediately that Cream's knowledge of the murders was too detailed to be innocent. He began following Cream, documenting his movements, observing his contacts with prostitutes, noting his obsessive attention to news coverage of the case. After several days of surveillance, Haynes contacted Inspector Harvey at the Scotland Yard, providing him with Cream's new address and a detailed account of his activities. Harvey moved cautiously. He wanted to ensure that Cream could not escape again, that the arrest would be clean and the evidence sufficient for prosecution. He assigned men to maintain surveillance while he assembled a complete case, gathering additional witnesses, obtaining samples of Cream's handwriting from various sources, building a prosecution that would be unassailable. The surveillance continued for 2 weeks, during which Cream apparently sensed no danger, continued his routine of walking the streets and writing his letters and approaching women with his pills. The arrest came on the 3rd of June 1892, more than 7 weeks after the deaths of Emma Shrivel and Alice Marsh. Cream was walking on Westminster Bridge Road in broad daylight when Harvey and 3 other detectives surrounded him. He appeared surprised but not alarmed, initially denied being Thomas Cream, claimed his name was Thomas Neill, and that he was a respectable physician being mistaken for someone else. But when shown the photograph from his previous lodgings, when confronted with evidence linking him to the purchase of strychnine, when informed that multiple witnesses had identified him as the man seen with the murdered women, his composure cracked slightly. He was taken to Bow Street Police Station, searched, and found to be carrying several items of interest: pills containing strychnine identical to those given to the murdered women, a notebook listing names and addresses of prostitutes throughout South London, drafts of letters accusing various physicians of murder, and a substantial sum of money divided among various pockets as if to prevent its complete loss in case of theft. He refused to answer questions without a solicitor present, maintained his claim that he was being falsely accused, insisted that he was a victim of mistaken identity despite the overwhelming evidence against him. The investigation of his background began immediately, revealing a history far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Communications with Canadian and American authorities uncovered his previous conviction for poisoning in Illinois, his suspicious history with female patients in Montreal, a pattern of behaviour stretching back nearly 2 decades. The current charges, the murders of Emma Shrivel and Alice Marsh, were only the most recent manifestation of pathology that had been expressing itself throughout his adult life. The bodies of Ellen Donworth and Matilda Clover were exhumed, subjected to thorough post-mortem examination with knowledge of what to look for. Dr. Stevenson found traces of strychnine in tissues that had been preserved by the chemical properties of the poison itself, evidence that death had not been natural as the original inquest had concluded. Additional charges were prepared, the case expanded to include 4 murders rather than 2, the magnitude of Cream's crimes becoming clear. He was formally charged on the 10th of June with 4 counts of murder, remanded to custody without possibility of bail, held in Newgate Prison to await trial. His solicitor entered a plea of not guilty, raised the possibility of an insanity defence, began the process of preparing for what promised to be one of the most sensational murder trials in recent British history. Cream himself remained calm, seemingly confident that he would be acquitted, convinced even now that his superior intelligence would prevail over the merely ordinary minds arrayed against him. In his cell at Newgate he wrote more letters, still trying to manipulate the investigation, still claiming to possess evidence that would exonerate him while implicating others. The letters went unanswered. The machinery of Victorian justice had finally grasped what should have been obvious from the beginning, and it would not release its hold until Thomas Neill Cream had been tried, convicted, and sentenced according to the law that he had violated so egregiously. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. The trial of Thomas Neill Cream opened at the Old Bailey on the 17th of October 1892, more than 4 months after his arrest. The intervening time had been consumed by legal preparations, by the gathering of evidence from 3 countries, by the construction of a prosecution case that would demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant had deliberately murdered 4 women by administering poison to them under the guise of medical treatment. The Attorney General himself led the prosecution, a mark of the case's significance, while Cream was represented by a prominent criminal barrister who would attempt the difficult task of creating reasonable doubt in the face of overwhelming evidence. The courtroom was crowded from the moment the doors opened, the public gallery filled with spectators eager to witness the trial of the Lambeth Poisoner, as the newspapers had christened him. The press benches were packed with reporters from every major London newspaper and several provincial and foreign publications, their pencils ready to record every detail for readers who followed the case with morbid fascination. The crimes had captured the public imagination in ways that more straightforward murders did not. There was something peculiarly horrifying about a physician who used his knowledge to kill rather than heal, about a man who approached vulnerable women under the pretense of offering help while actually delivering death. Cream entered the dock wearing a well-tailored dark suit, his appearance that of a respectable professional man rather than a murderer. He showed no obvious signs of distress or shame, surveying the courtroom with what appeared to be detached interest, as if he were an observer of the proceedings rather than their subject. His expression was difficult to read. Some reporters described it as arrogant, others as merely calm. A few suggested they detected underlying madness in his eyes, though this might have been imagination informed by knowledge of his crimes. The prosecution's case unfolded over 4 days, a methodical presentation of evidence that built from Cream's arrival in London through his identification and arrest. The Attorney General began with the deaths of Emma Shrivel and Alice Marsh, the murders for which the evidence was strongest and most direct. He called witnesses who had seen Cream with the women on the night of their deaths, who had observed him giving them pills, who had noted his rapid departure from Orient buildings shortly before the screaming began. The landlord testified about discovering the bodies, described the scene in terms that made several spectators gasp, and one woman faint, requiring a brief adjournment while she was carried from the courtroom. Dr. Thomas Stevenson provided expert testimony about the nature of strychnine poisoning, explaining to the jury how the poison worked, what symptoms it produced, why death was so agonizing and protracted. He described the post-mortem examinations of both Emma and Alice, detailed the findings that indicated strychnine as the cause of death, presented chemical analysis that confirmed the presence of the poison in their tissues. His testimony was technical but comprehensible, painting a picture of death that was both scientifically precise and emotionally powerful. The prosecution then presented evidence linking Cream to the purchase of strychnine, calling the chemist who had sold him the poison, and who identified him positively as the customer who had signed the poison register as Thomas Neill. The register itself was entered as evidence. Cream's signature compared to other examples of his handwriting, the similarity unmistakable. The pills found in his possession at the time of his arrest were shown to the jury, their strychnine content confirmed by laboratory analysis, their composition identical to those given to the murdered women. The case against Cream for the murders of Ellen Donworth and Matilda Clover required more inference, as no witnesses had seen him with these women on the nights of their deaths, but the prosecution built a compelling circumstantial case. The landlady from Duke Street testified that Ellen had received a gentleman visitor on the evening of her death, a man who matched Cream's description. Other prostitutes testified that Cream had been giving pills to women throughout the district, that he had specifically approached Ellen and offered her medicine. The letters that Cream had written about Ellen's death were presented. Their author's detailed knowledge of circumstances that had not been made public offered as evidence that only the murderer could have possessed such information. The exhumation and re-examination of both bodies provided physical evidence that had not been available during the original inquests. Dr. Stevenson testified that both women had died of strychnine poisoning, that the symptoms recorded at the time were consistent with this conclusion, that the original verdicts of death by natural causes had been incorrect. The prosecution argued that Cream had killed these women using the same method he would later employ against Emma and Alice, that his pattern of behaviour stretched across months, that he was a serial murderer who had killed at least 4 women and possibly more whose deaths had not yet been connected to him. The letters themselves became a central element of the prosecution's case. More than 30 letters were entered as evidence, all in Cream's handwriting, all containing accusations of murder, many demanding money in exchange for clients. The prosecution argued that the letters demonstrated guilty knowledge, that Cream had been simultaneously trying to direct suspicion toward innocent parties, while also attempting to profit from the crimes he himself had committed. The letters revealed a mind that was cunning but also disturbed, clever in some ways but also possessed by obsessions that led to self-destructive behaviour. The defence attempted several strategies, none particularly successful. They challenged the identification evidence, suggesting that witnesses might have been mistaken, that Cream merely resembled the man who'd been seen with the victims, but too many witnesses identified him with too much certainty for this approach to create substantial doubt. They questioned the forensic evidence, bringing their own medical experts to suggest that the post-mortem findings were ambiguous, that strychnine poisoning could be confused with other conditions. But Dr. Stevenson's reputation was unassailable, and his findings were supported by chemical analysis that the defence experts could not effectively challenge. The defence's strongest argument was that the prosecution had failed to establish motive. Why would a physician with independent means and no apparent connection to the victims choose to murder prostitutes? What did he gain from these crimes? The prosecution could offer no rational explanation beyond suggesting that Cream killed because he enjoyed killing, because he derived satisfaction from exercising power over vulnerable women, because some defect in his character made him incapable of normal human empathy. This explanation satisfied the jury, even if it failed to provide the kind of comprehensible motive that made most murders understandable. The defence attempted to raise insanity as an issue, suggesting that no sane person would commit such crimes or write such letters. But Victorian law set a high bar for the insanity defence, requiring that the defendant be shown to have been incapable of knowing the difference between right and wrong at the time of the offence. The evidence demonstrated that Cream had known his actions were wrong, he had concealed them, had fled when threatened with exposure, had attempted to direct suspicion toward others. His behaviour after the murders showed calculation and awareness, not the derangement that would have supported an insanity plea. Cream himself did not testify. Decision his barrister made over his apparent objections. The risk of putting him on the witness stand was too great. Under cross-examination, his arrogance and lack of remorse would likely have convinced the jury of his guilt more effectively than any other evidence. Instead, the defence relied on attacking the prosecution's case, trying to create doubt about individual pieces of evidence, hoping that if they could undermine enough specific points, the overall case might collapse. It was a strategy born of desperation, employed when no better option existed. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. The Attorney General reviewed the evidence methodically, building point upon point, demonstrating that each piece supported the others, that the totality formed a picture of guilt that could not be reasonably denied. He spoke directly about the victims, reminding the jury that these were women whose lives, however unfortunate their circumstances, had value, who had been entitled to the law's protection, who had been betrayed by a man who approached them under the guise of offering help while intending only to kill them. He characterized Cream as a predator who had selected victims based on their vulnerability, who had exploited their poverty and their desperate need to survive, who had shown them no mercy as they died in agony. The defence's closing argument was shorter, a final attempt to raise doubt, to suggest that the case against Cream, while suggestive, was not conclusive beyond a reasonable doubt. But the barrister's heart did not seem in it. He had been given an impossible task, and he performed it professionally but without conviction. The jury's faces showed that they had already reached their conclusion. The judge's instructions to the jury were thorough and fair, explaining the law of murder, defining what constituted proof beyond reasonable doubt, reminding them that the defendant was presumed innocent and that the burden of proof rested entirely on the prosecution. But his review of the evidence was damning, presenting each element of the prosecution's case without comment, but with an emphasis that made clear what conclusions he believed the evidence supported. The jury retired to deliberate at 3:30 on the afternoon of October the 21st. They returned at 4:15, having taken less than an hour to reach their verdict. The foreman stood when asked by the clerk of the court, stated clearly that they found the defendant guilty of murder on all counts. Cream showed no visible reaction, his expression remaining neutral, though one reporter claimed to have seen his hands tighten on the rail of the dock. The judge placed the black cap upon his head, the traditional symbol that he was about to pronounce sentence of death and address the convicted murderer. The words were formal, ritual phrases that had been spoken in English courtrooms for centuries. Thomas Neill Cream was sentenced to death by hanging, the sentence to be carried out at Newgate Prison at a time to be determined by the proper authorities. He was given an opportunity to speak, to offer any reason why sentence should not be pronounced, but he remained silent. He was led from the dock by warders, taken down the stairs to the cells beneath the Old Bailey, removed from public view for what would prove to be the final time in his life. The newspapers printed extra editions announcing the verdict, the crowds that had gathered outside the Old Bailey receiving the news with satisfaction. The trial had been followed closely, the evidence reported in detail, and public opinion had concluded Cream's guilt long before the jury delivered its verdict. There was no sympathy for him, no suggestion that he deserved mercy. He had killed women who were vulnerable and powerless, had done so deliberately and repeatedly, had shown no remorse for his actions. Victorian society, whatever its failures and hypocrisies, had no tolerance for such cruelty when it could no longer be ignored. Cream was held at Newgate Prison while his solicitor pursued the appeals that were automatic in capital cases. But no grounds for overturning the conviction could be found. The trial had been conducted properly. The evidence had been overwhelming, the verdict was supported by the facts. The appeal was denied, the execution date was set for November the 15th. and Cream was informed that he had less than 3 weeks to prepare himself for death. He spent those weeks writing letters, still trying to manipulate events, still claiming innocence, still attempting to direct suspicion toward others. He wrote to newspapers, to government officials, to anyone he thought might have influence. The letters were not answered. He was visited by a chaplain who attempted to encourage repentance to secure some acknowledgement of guilt that might provide spiritual comfort in his final days. Cream refused to confess, maintained his innocence, insisted until the end that he was the victim of a conspiracy. The night before his execution, he was moved to the condemned cell, a small room adjacent to the execution chamber, where he would spend his final hours under constant observation. He slept poorly, pacing the cell, writing more letters that would never be posted, speaking occasionally to the warders who watched him, but saying nothing of significance. Morning came early, the grey light of a November dawn barely penetrating the prison's high windows, the sounds of the city awakening muffled by old walls 3 feet thick. At 8 o'clock on the morning of November the 15th, 1892, Thomas Neill Cream was led from the condemned cell into the execution chamber. The hangman, James Billington, had prepared the gallows during the night, testing the mechanism, calculating the drop based on Cream's weight, ensuring that death would be as instantaneous as the science of judicial execution could make it. Cream walked to the trapdoor without resistance, his hands bound behind his back, his legs strapped together. The noose was placed around his neck, the white hood drawn over his head. Billington pulled the lever and the trapdoor opened, and Thomas Neill Cream dropped into darkness. The prison physician examined the body and pronounced death instantaneous, the neck broken cleanly, consciousness extinguished before pain could register. The body was left hanging for the prescribed hour before being taken down and buried within the prison grounds, in an unmarked grave among dozens of others, the final resting place of those whom society had judged unworthy of any memorial. No mourners attended, no prayers were said beyond the ritual words the chaplain spoke over all such burials. Thomas Neill Cream had ceased to exist in every way that mattered. The murders he committed remained infamous for a generation, studied by those interested in criminal psychology, cited as evidence of the dangers posed by those who possessed knowledge but lacked conscience. The women he killed, Ellen Donworth, Matilda Clover, Emma Shrivel, Alice Marsh, were commemorated only in trial records and newspaper accounts, their names preserved as victims rather than as persons, their lives reduced to the manner of their deaths. The poverty and social structures that had made them vulnerable, that had placed them in Cream's path, that had delayed justice until 4 women were dead, these remained unchanged, and other women would continue to die in similar circumstances, killed by other men, forgotten with similar speed. The fog rolled in over London as winter approached. The Thames disappeared behind curtains of grey mist, and the city continued its vast, indifferent life, consuming and discarding millions of souls, remembering only those whose deaths or achievements forced themselves into the historical record against the current of forgetfulness that was the common fate of ordinary humanity. The gas lamps came on each evening at dusk, their light pushing back shadows that would return when the lamps were extinguished. And in those shadows, then and always, moved those who preyed upon the vulnerable, those whom society failed to protect, those whose deaths would be noted with resignation rather than outrage, unless by chance their killer was finally caught and made to answer for crimes that should never have been allowed to continue for so long. The candles burned low in the halls of justice, and the ledgers closed on Thomas Neill Cream's account. And the great wheel of history turned forward into years that would bring new horrors and new victims and new failures of the systems meant to protect the innocent. The night was quiet now, the story told, the reckoning complete. And in the silence that followed, the only sound was the whisper of pages turning in the archives, where the dead waited patient and forgotten, their stories preserved in fading ink, their lives reduced to evidence in cases closed long ago. The tale is finished. Let the darkness take what remains. Epilogue. the execution of Thomas Neill. Cream did not end all questions about his crimes. In the years that followed, theories multiplied about whether he had killed others whose deaths had never been connected to him. His time in Chicago before his imprisonment remained obscure, marked by rumours of women patients who had died under mysterious circumstances. His months in Canada and America between his release from prison and his arrival in London remained largely unaccounted for, leaving open the possibility that other victims existed whose deaths had been attributed to natural causes or accident. Some criminologists and amateur investigators became convinced that Cream had been Jack the Ripper, pointing to similarities between the Whitechapel murders of 1888 and Cream's pattern of killing prostitutes. This theory was ultimately dismissed on chronological grounds. Cream had been imprisoned in Illinois during the period when the Ripper murders occurred, making it impossible for him to have been in London at the relevant times. But the persistence of such theories spoke to a larger truth about Victorian crime, that many murders went unsolved not because they were particularly sophisticated, but because society did not devote sufficient resources to investigating deaths among the poor and marginalised. The case prompted some reforms in how the Metropolitan Police investigated suspicious deaths, particularly those involving women working as prostitutes. Their recognition that Ellen Donworth and Matilda Clover's deaths should have triggered immediate investigation, rather than being dismissed as natural causes, led to revised protocols for inquests and post-mortem examinations. But these reforms were limited and imperfectly implemented, and women continued to die in circumstances that attracted minimal official attention. The women Cream killed were never properly memorialised. Their graves remained unmarked, their lives uncommented beyond the bare facts recorded in trial testimony. They existed in history only as victims, their personhood reduced to their manner of death. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their fate, that they had lived and struggled and hoped and suffered, and all of it had been erased except for the final moments when poison destroyed them. They deserved better, both in life and in memory, but Victorian society had little capacity for recognising the humanity of women it had already judged and dismissed as fallen. Thomas Neill Cream was buried in Newgate Prison's graveyard in an unmarked grave, his body interred without ceremony among dozens of other executed criminals. The grave was later disturbed when the prison was demolished in the early 20th century. The bodies exhumed and reburied in a mass grave at an undisclosed location. Even in death, his physical remains were treated with the same disregard that he had shown to his victims, scattered and forgotten, reduced to anonymous bones in anonymous earth. The story faded from public consciousness with the speed characteristic of newspaper sensations. Within a year, new crimes had captured popular attention, and Cream was remembered only by those with professional interest in criminal history. The details blurred, the victims' names were forgotten, the case became a footnote in the larger narrative of Victorian crime. But the pattern he represented, the predator who selected vulnerable victims, who used his position and knowledge to gain their trust, who killed without apparent motive beyond the satisfaction killing gave him, this pattern would repeat itself throughout history in London and elsewhere, the names and circumstances changing but the fundamental dynamic remaining constant. The night is very quiet now. The story has reached its end, all accounts settled, all judgments rendered. The fog has lifted, the streets are empty, the gas lamps have been extinguished. In the archives the files rest undisturbed, the testimony preserved in fading ink, the photographs yellowing with age. The dead sleep in their forgotten graves, their stories told for the last time, their voices silent forever. And history, having recorded what it deemed necessary, closes the book and turns its attention elsewhere, to other crimes and other victims, to the endless succession of human cruelty and suffering that fills the ledgers of the past. Rest now, the tale is finished. The Bedside Historian has led you through these dark corridors of history, shown you the horrors that unfolded in fog-bound streets more than a century ago. Let the images fade, let the details blur, let sleep take you into dreams less troubled than the reality we have witnessed. The dead cannot be saved, the past cannot be changed, but their stories can be remembered, and in remembering we honour them more than their own time did.